Today's pastel painting demo takes our crazy acrylic underpainting, the subject of our previous StudioSense video, and creates a completed pastel painting. Our lesson will highlight the basics of painting rocks and tree trunks. We'll demonstrate the use of bold color and sharp contrast, aerial perspective, and handling glare and very bright backlighting in a scene. Please visit my YouTube store. Any subscribers to my YouTube channel, use YouTube sub and you can receive 30% off on all original paintings and prints. Okay, let's get started. So here's the crazy acrylic underpainting. The photograph on the left is obviously the reference photograph. It's pretty washed out. It doesn't have a whole lot of color to it. So we're going to really spike this thing with with significant chroma and color here. I'm starting with pan pastels. If you've seen those, they're applied with a sponge type brush. And I'm blocking in the sky. Most of it is a very light blue. I'll mix in some white just to lighten up that blue closer to the horizon, and ultimately I'll bring some very light orange into the sky using the pan pastels toward the horizon point where the rocks and the tree line that you'll see behind here meet the sky. Typically when I do a painting with a lot of detail and variety in the foreground, I'll keep the sky very simple. There's no clouds in the sky. I think there were a few fluffy clouds, but I'm just keeping it real basic. I don't want it to distract from the main subject here, which is the tree trunks and the rock structure here. This was inspired by a hike on the Tolmy Peak Trail at Mount Rainier National Park. As you undoubtedly noticed with my StudioSense videos, they are speeded up 2 times the actual recording speed. So the distance in the hazy section, looking at that reference photo, was very washed out. The leaf, the canopy of the trees was extremely washed out with that sunlight backlighting. So what I've done here is when I applied the acrylic, and go back and look at the crazy acrylic underpainting video and see what I did there with the acrylic to create that very light misty look of the leaf canopies. The rocks, great contrast in these rocks, and I would suggest when you paint rocks, really get the deep dark colors of the shaded areas. I mean, this is a very deep blue. It's almost a blackish blue. It's one of my darkest blues, and I'm simply highlighting where I've created that deep black and blue color with the acrylic underpainting. Typically when I would do an acrylic underpainting, the values that I've established with the acrylic paint would replicate the values of the pastels layered on later. In this particular case, I'll be bringing up some even lighter values to pick up the highlights. The acrylic didn't really create the highlights that I wanted to see with the light reflections on the edges of the rocks. So we're going to kick up that value a little bit more when we do the highlights on the edges. But at this point, what we want to do is start to get the basic shapes of the structures of the rocks that are on this particular hillside on this trail. So here I am outlining rock edges here and there using blues, gray blues, even some black for some of the really deep crevices. So the various dark and light masses in the painting will give balance. So if I'm working on a dark mass in one section here, I'd like to see another piece of a dark mass on another section. As you can see to the lower right of the initial tree trunk there, it's very dark, and it kind of balances nicely with the darks along that diagonal that's heading sort of like up toward the upper left of the canvas. These trees were very interesting. There's a lot of striations, vertical creases in the trees, and I like to use this dark red-brown pastel. It's a hard pastel, and it does really good work in terms of highlighting some of those really dark crevices of the tree trunk and the lines. Think about, the how the pattern in the trees are established. Are they vertical, like in this particular tree, or are they more horizontal and rounded around the tree? The pastels I'm using, most of them are Great American, Unison, and Mount Vision. I'll use a little bit of Sennelier, and of course in the beginning when I blocked out the sky, I used pan pastels. As for the colors in this painting, I will balance out color that I have in the tree trunk with the rocks. So there's a type of a mauve color in here, kind of like a mid-value reddish mauve color. I'm going to use both in the tree trunk as well as in the rocks. And similarly, this light gray pastel that I'm using now to capture the edge of the tree, I will also use that as a highlight on the rock edges. Like you can see a little bit of it on the left rock edges where you do have a lighter value. Purple is another one of my favorites. There's a gray purple hard pastel I use, and it's fantastic in terms of conveying a distant object in the landscape. In this particular case, the trees were not so distant, but the light from the sky behind it really faded them out. So I'm using a light purple here, pastel, as well as a little bit of a similar value blue. Here's my trusty tortillon to help carve out that main crevice in the tree trunk, and that'll also help smooth the gradation of the darks and lights in the tree trunk. So there's a light right edge of the tree trunk, and compare that to the dark shaded rocks behind it. So it's great to, you look for these opportunities to build contrast in your paintings with edges. Some edges are lost, some edges are found, and some are very emphatic and contrast, and others are you're kind of losing an edge here and there. Um, and we'll see some of that develop in this pastel painting. This is the pastel I'm using now for the canopy of the tree, of the distant tree. I'm using like it's a green, blue, gray type mid-value um, pastel, very similar actually to the acrylic color that I'm placing these pastels on top of. Think about patterns now. When we think about composition, think about the patterns that you build in a painting. So the darker part of the tree canopy became a pattern here. So as you could see, there's obviously the dark shaded areas of the canopy are created one type of mass within the tree, and you could kind of connect that, or you could vary that. Sort of like what you really want to do is you think about the viewer of the painting and how that viewer will look through the painting and be captured within portions of the painting, and just see where the viewer's eye goes in looking at various points of the composition. So you'll want to use darks and lights to help guide that or influence that viewer's perception and enjoyment of the landscape painting. The local color here, there was really strong local color in the foreground, the rocks, as well as the nearest leaves in this tree. So this is more of a bold green, and I'll be bringing also more bolder green yellows and yellows into this painting. And that certainly contrasts with that hazy distant canopy that you see on the second tree off to the right. So I'll spend a fair amount of time working on the tree here. This is a palette knife, a simple plastic palette knife. Again, because of the lighting behind the tree, we get a lot of haze, and it's not haze, it's just blurriness. and that's picked up in the photograph. So I'll start spreading some of this color, some of this pastel into the tree canopy. You know, when I get to the rocks, there's some very interesting drippy acrylic paint effects that you could see here, especially that right there in the middle. Looks like it's dripping from the first tree trunk there. We'll need to deal with those in some fashion. You know, it's really fun when you do an acrylic underpainting and you just let it go wild and just see what transpires. You'll recall it when you go back to the video to watch it again, that often the acrylic, the liquid will pool at the bottom of the canvas, the bottom of the mounted pastel paper, and you want to dab that up and absorb that with a paper towel. The surface does tend to get a little bit bumpy with all that wetness, but that actually kind of adds character to the painting, and it's really not a big issue unless it's extremely lifted from the mounted board. But this particular painting didn't really lift much at all. And I was kind of careful in terms of controlling the drips of acrylic. But so with the rocks anyway, so we'll work on covering some of those drippy effects, but also some of them we'll use for the final painting, and we won't modify them very much at all. So there was a tree line behind this scene above the rocks out in the distance, and here I'm using very light yellow green, and really it's more of the local color that I'm conveying, even though it's distance, because of the sunlight that morning. It was about 7:30 a.m. West Coast time, obviously at Mount Rainier, and there was a really cool sense of sunlight in that distance. This is a very light Mount Vision high value, light value orange pastel, which I find real handy to do highlights. So the light in the photograph, you could see, if you blow it up too on your screen, you could see there's some really strong, vibrant reflections of sun on the edges of the rocks. So that's going to be one of the focal points of the characteristics of this painting that I wanted to highlight, is how the sunlight grabbed edges of rocks and edges of branches and a portion of the tree, and created these really strong, vibrant highlights. So this is like a yellow, white, very high value pastels that I'm using for the distance, and a little bit of that gray, green gray, but very muted color to convey that there's a tree line back there, but absolutely no details at all will be applied to that distance. It almost looks like it's a foggy impact, but it was a pure, clear, sunny, dry day at Mount Rainier National Park. In handling my pastels, I'm typically using the sides of the pastels, especially as we're building these rock edges, using the whole length of a pastel to sharply capture a rock edge. In some cases, when I want to get a little more dappled variety of color, I'll use the point of the pastel. Bring in a little bit of green yellows in here because that is where most of the sunlight is emanating through this tree canopy is pretty much in the center of the canopy. I didn't draw any individual leaves. You don't want to do that. Just create the masses of value and color to build your tree canopy. I brought in some blues into the tree also, some mid-value blue hard pastel in addition to my purples. Now I got to carve out those leaves in some fashion, so these are sort of like this very light yellow orange pastel is being used to help carve out some of the tree holes, showing some of those gaps. So a major characteristic of this painting is how the foreground ends up being really sharp between the rocks and the striations of the tree trunk, and how that contrasts with the soft distance. This is a strong orange, soft pastel I'm applying to some of those highlighted areas, and I'm varying the highlights also. Um, let's not apply the same color and value to the whole section of air rock that's picking up the sun. You want to kind of vary the values a little bit in it too, and the color. So I had a deeper orange closer to the rocks, the lower portion of the rocks, as they head down the hill, but a lighter yellow, whitish highlight at the tops where the sun was hitting them. And so you'll want to bring also some of that highlight color into the tree trunks in various spots. So again, it's this balance in your painting between the different sections of values, the darks and lights, and also the color, having a similar color in one spot of the painting and bringing that to another part where it works. You can be pretty creative there too, because you could apply, if you have a dark shaded area as an example, and we'll show how I'm doing that here. We're bringing in some other dark mauve and brown colors. Here's the example right here. There's various bumps, right? Bumps and cracks, etc. In the rocks, in the shade. So we're bringing in slightly different values of different colors, and but they're very close to the dark value. They're not really. We don't want to go too many value layers different, right, from the dark value of the rocks. So this is a mid value, kind of like a brown orange that I'm using here. So we're conveying both vertical and horizontal cracks in these rocks. I like to blow up my reference photos on my computer. They're all digital, and really study what I'm looking at to capture effectively the textures of the rocks as well as the tree trunk. Here I'm using a very light, it's kind of like a pinkish orange hard pastel to carve out some of the rock edges. Notice they're not parallel. There's even though there's this structure of the rocks kind of falling, this fault, if you will, kind of falling from this hill. We're not going to make them terribly parallel. We're going to vary those lines too. We tend to like to repeat things when we do paintings, and we're trying to avoid that here by varying the direction of the lines, for example. So it's time to do some branches. There actually are a lot of branches that are visible in this tree, and we'll pick up with a dark brown hard edge of a pastel. We'll begin to create some of these branches, and when we work the branches in a little more detail, and this is one of the more detailed features of the painting, we'll vary the values there. The thinner branches will be a lighter value, and we'll use a hard edge of a pastel. I believe it's a Rembrandt pastel that I was using. Also, I forgot to mention I use Rembrandt pastels too to help carve out some of the branches, and we'll make sure they're covered up too with leaves here and there. Can't forget in the reference photo there is a rock down below at the lower left portion of the tree trunk. So this color here I mean, it's kind of a light value, but it's not as light as the highlighted values. In my pastel paintings, I like to convey movement and action, color and movement. I want to show motion in my paintings, and there are certainly different ways of doing that. The subject itself may be conveying motion, such as a windy day and the trees blowing, but in this particular case it was a still day, there wasn't any wind. But the motion here in this painting is conveyed by the first of all, the acrylic impact here on the inner painting and the drips and the movements there of the color, but also the difference between the muted tree canopy in the distance and the sharpness of the foreground. And that creates a certain sense of, I'm going to call it maybe a certain sense of excitement or tension. I think tension is the proper word here, between the foreground and the background. And that's kind of like how I conveyed movement in this painting. Using some deep browns and deep brown reds for some of the to capture some of the nuances within the rocks. So what struck me about this particular reference photo, because the subject itself, it's not, it's interesting, but it doesn't strike you as, hey, I want to do a painting of this scene, right? So and it really was the angle or the perspective that I'm using in this particular composition, looking up toward that strong light as the sun was rising above the mountains there at Mount Rainier National Park, and the structure of these rocks. And it seemed so interesting to really hone in on this particular element of the landscape to convey this in a painting. So you want to vary some of those values too. That you don't want your lightest highlights here. You will take a little bit of a darker and a lighter touch also with the pastel to build again where light is reflecting through the portions of the rocks, but not directly on top of the rocks, in terms of the edges at the top of this rock structure here, where it will show the brightest highlights. So a little more dark crevices and again more contrast in the foreground. Notice how the colors are very similar to the dark crevice contrast in the tree between the tree trunk and the rocks and the crevices in the rocks. I just work various parts of the paintings wherever I feel like I want to do next, and or whatever part I want to work on for the next portion of painting. Stand back at your from your paintings, and stop, look at them, go back, take some notes, go back and make some adjustments, and it's pretty much what I'm doing as I decide which part of the painting I want to enhance. It usually typically done toward the end of the painting. When I'm just about done, I'll let it sit there, and I'll come back to it the next morning, and I'll say, okay, I want to change this, I want to make an adjustment here and there. Typically it's just a minor change to the painting. So the acrylic actually did a lot of the heavy lifting in terms of building out this rock structure. I found that I finished the rocks much sooner than I did on the tree canopy. The tree canopy will take more work, which we'll see in a moment. So we're really building a sharp and bold foreground here, and a faint and muted distance. So this painting has, or will have once we're done, simultaneous strength and delicacy, or soft edges. I like all these little small sharp contrasts and the deep accents that we're building here in the foreground. Getting a lot of mauve colors and blues. This here, again, to build a little more to that detail, is a very sharp edge of a Rembrandt pastel, and it's another, again, a deep brown red color. Technically, I'm not following the reference photo any longer, except for some of the major points of the photo where there's some major cracks in the rocks, like as you can look at the reference photo now in the tree and see how I created those one horizontal, one kind of a diagonal crack in the rocks. But you want to kind of start using the reference photo. Really, that's really the purpose of it, is reference, is to capture the textures and convey them, but you don't have to replicate, you don't have to copy it. You can kind of create your own. And again, remember, we're trying to with composition, we're trying to guide that viewer's eye through the painting. So we want to enhance the picture, or the landscape photo, to serve that purpose. There's a lot of dirt down here, and roots. So I'm going to convey with a burnt orange pastel, and this is a unison, and also a soft, I think it's a Great American Works dark brown for some of the roots, the shaded areas of the roots, and it'll bring up a little bit of a highlight on those roots also. I like to often use some really vibrant and sometimes rather unique color and juxtapose complementary colors. So look at, when you look at a reference photo, look at the colors of the scene and even make some up and exaggerate. Not too crazy though. So I'll bring in a little bit of really strong red in this dirt area in a little bit. Just a few dots of red really adds some nice variety to it. My preference is acrylic underpaintings. I like to use orange, reds, and purples, deep blues. At this point, I had expanded or enlarged the digital image. You don't see it here though. I've enlarged the digital image to see the blemishes in the rocks, and almost look like they were like fossil images on the sides of the rocks, little circles and spots and things. So I only saw that by enlarging the photo, and I was able to create the effect of that with slightly different values in the dark shade of the rocks. There's this boulder on the lower left, lower right, right below the tree trunk, that had like two cracks in it. It looks like in a couple of months that of rain and ice and freezing and thawing, that it would just crack apart. So I'm painting that now with a, certainly it was a deep blue for the crevices, and then working some of the mid value and then lighter values on top of this particular rock. So yeah, I would encourage you to go back and take a look at the crazy acrylic underpainting video and see what I did. I roughly sketched out the composition with a, by the way, here's some of that red that I want to convey in that lower section of the tree, as well as in the ground of the dirt nearby. But I had roughly sketched out the composition with it was a hard pastel, deep green, and fixed it with a fixative, and then worked the acrylic over it using a variety of ultramarine blue and alizarin crimson, and a little bit of black in there too to mixed in. I realized that I had not been doing much to the right side of this tree here, so there is more landscape to convey, and there is a like a large rock large rock to the right side of the tree to really complete covering the painting, except for there is a blank spot in the upper left. I didn't notice that till toward the very end of the painting. So if you look at the upper left, there's just a very light section there that that actually is just the surface of the UArt paper. I'm using UArt 400 grade sanded paper. Before you saw that I was conveying a little bit more light value to the right edge of the tree. At some point what we're going to do is soften that even further, because the sunlight from behind is kind of wrapping around the rounded tree trunk, and we want to convey that soft edge. So as I mentioned about what struck me about this particular scene is the is the vantage point that that this particular scene expressed to me. An angled, such an angled view. You know, the horizon line, which is this layer of rocks and sticks and things, is an angled horizon line, and there's nice balance between the direction of the trees going one direction, and the horizon going in another direction. So to wrap up this section of the painting, there's just a kind of a, it was a rounded, weathered boulder on the right side of the large tree here that really picked up a lot of the glare from the early morning sun. So we're pretty soft in creating that. We did have a shaded area though in it, and that, as you can see there, helps build that contrast with the highlighted edge of the tree trunk. You know, pastels get dirty, and typically what I would do is just wipe off the edge of the pastel or a portion of it with a cloth, keep them clean. This is actually a blue pastel, but it's such a high value. It almost looks white, but if you compare it to white, you'll see that it does have blue in it, and I'm using that to help lighten up the sky behind this rock here, to help form the rock a little bit better, the rock on the right of the tree, but also to create that glare look that that was evident here in the reference photo. So certainly the photo itself did a lot of the glare work for me. You know, there's a difference, of course, as we know, between a photograph, looking at it and seeing how it makes the shaded areas almost black, and the light areas, it totally washes them out. I'm sure there was a sky behind here of blue, of some type of a blue color. Maybe there was a cloud, or a fluffy cloud, for example, but I didn't see that. You don't see it in the reference photo. So just a lot of light, and I do like to highlight light, if you will, in my paintings, and contrast with dark shaded areas. Not to forget that middle section there, again, where this dirt and roots, where the dirt and the roots are. More strong reflections of light on the rock edges. And again, a little softer touch. You could use the same value of a pastel, but with a softer touch, you could, on top of a darker area, you could bring the value down of that color. And then if you soften it up even further with your finger blending or with a tortillon, that could also help reduce the value of that pastel stick, even though it's one particular value, obviously. But if it could be used as a highlight, you can actually use it as a lesser highlight, if you will, in the darker areas of the painting by just applying it more softly. So here's that drippy section now, and what I'm going to do here is I'm going to apply a yellow pastel, yellow-orange pastel, to use that drippy section of the acrylic as suggesting that the sunlight is edging down toward the toward the edge of that boulder. And I'll break it up a bit in a little while, but that's where, if you're doing an underpainting, and it's, the underpainting provides a good guide in terms of the values of the painting if you're doing an underpainting to convey the values of it. But it's also good is to create some of these really weird, odd effects that are truly creative, and try to use some of that, or have some of that acrylic paint show through the pastel painting. Now let's be clear that if you're doing a pastel painting and you're submitting it for a juried competition, typically the rule is 80% of the painting's got to be pastel, which suggests that there could be parts that are acrylic or some other type of underpainting or other medium for the other 20%. In this particular painting, at the end of the day, I think I had more acrylic paint showing through it, especially in the rocks, than any of the previous paintings that I did with an acrylic underpainting. So let's talk about focal points for a moment here. So when I think of a focal point for this painting, I'm really thinking of the probably the center portion of that main tree and the rocks below it, or right to the left of it, that really reflects the strongest sunlight hitting that landscape. So that's kind of like the focal area. But you kind of go from, if I look at it, see this large light colored rock on the lower left here, your eyes kind of go from that rock up toward that very bright area, toward just about in the center of the painting. Not quite in the center, it's sort of like to the left of center, and a little bit higher than the halfway point vertically in the canvas. So that's kind of like what the focal area is, and your eyes kind of draw you up into the tree canopy, and how wispy and faded it all looks up above. Just a little more detail here and there. I certainly also have some old NuPastels that help with some sharp effects. Here again, here's the Rembrandt deep red brown sharp edged pastel for creating some more branches. And just vary the values of the branches too. Some of the branches, which you'll see, will pick up some direct sunlight, so they'll have more of an orange glow to them. The tortillon does come in handy in transitioning the values in a rock, for example. As you can see, the crevice of the rock, I softened it with the tortillon simply to more accurately convey the transition of values. So you want to think about also, talk about like drawing accuracy of your paintings. And is there something that's amiss that needs to be fixed? And what we'll do here, there will be an error in this painting. We're going to fix that. It might not necessarily be an error, depending on how nature could vary, but the tree trunk itself is obviously wider at the bottom and narrower at the top. And there are a couple of instances as I looked at this painting where the tree trunk got a little bit wider in some sections up above. That may be the case in certain circumstances, but I didn't think it was in this reference photo. So when I wrap up the tree trunk, I'm going to thin it out a bit uh, in the upper sections, pretty much where I'm working right now with this light color. I'm going to have to use, and I'll show you, I'll use a very thin paintbrush to brush off some of that extra pastel and just rework that section. Pastels can be very forgiving, and you can have the tools to make some corrections. You could even reuse your pastel paper by cleaning it off, erasing and washing it off, and just have a lot of flexibility with this medium. The top of that tree trunk, as you can see there, is really kind of more faded, similar in the reference photo too, where the light is wrapping around it. So we'll want to make sure that those edges are pretty soft. This again is this very light blue Mount Vision pastel. By showing a little more of that light in there, I'm creating more contrast against the branches, but it's also carving out a little more the sky holes of that distant tree line that you can barely see that sits atop the edge of the rocks in the distance. So you want to use, what's called the law of unequal proportions, and think about that. Don't repeat proportions, don't repeat shapes, show variety. The lower left of this painting has a big boulder type look to it, and then of course there's smaller ones later on. So those are obviously unequal proportions. The the top section of the rocks there, that angled diagonal section that heads up toward the upper left of the painting, those boulders are sort of unequal and off, and so again, there's a lot of chaos, right? There's chaos in the landscape, and you want your paintings to reflect that chaos. Here I'm reflecting some more sky holes to break up the canopy. As I mentioned, I think the canopy of the tree canopy took more work than the rocks. The rocks were heavy lifted by the acrylic underpainting. There's a certain local bold color in the portion of the tree right where the branches break out and the sun is strong, and then of course the rest is a more of a distant muted color. This also helps with the plastic pastel knife in softening some of those leaf masses. So you want to, it's really where the light wraps around the cluster of leaves, and that's where blending them or softening them with this pastel, with this palette knife, comes in handy. So there are various patterns in this tree canopy, patterns of yellow green, patterns of darker like purple blue. I find that purple works well in conveying shaded areas of green leaves and green tree canopies. So it's actually a nice underpainting color to apply purples behind your greens. We kind of are challenged with large green lawns if we're going to convey grasses, and purple is one of the nice colors, as well as a sort of like a brownish orange base of a grassy area that uh, that comes in handy. That works quite well with greens. Of course, blues work well with greens. So when you look at a painting that's got a lot of green in it, just think about what other colors you could bring in there, in addition to just the plain old green and the various values of green. So really the strokes of this, making the pastel strokes are vertical. So I'm holding the pastel in such a way that I'm conveying the vertical strokes of the tree, and that kind of helps support creating the tree appropriately technically. There's a little more sky hole back there too, so we want to kind of bring some of that in. So at this point, I'm really pleased with the rocks. As you can see, I'm working the trees a lot further, bringing in the the softness and the lighting, bringing in more branches. So again, that I think the contrast of that branch there, very similar to the reference photo, was really became also sort of like a focal point of the area and kind of draws your attention to that section of the painting. Again, a very sharp edge of a pastel for these branches. And they really go all over the place. They're all in all kinds of different directions, and I'm really not clear as what the source of the branches are. I think there were trees even above this that were hanging over the trail on the other side of the trail where we were walking, and they were kind of creeping into the into the photograph too. So it's kind of like a haphazard pattern of branches. A dark brown, sharp edge brown was used in the more the foreground area. As we get higher up in the tree and further distance, I'm using a more of a yellow ochre, and a light brown, sharp-edged pastel for the distance. And then I'll bring in some of that orange yellow light to be reflected on top of some of the branches. I really encourage my students to capitalize on the pastel medium. And in when you think about juried compositions, and if they're focused specifically on pastels, the jurors want to see how you've used the medium most effectively, and in some creative way you've used it. Maybe the pastel strokes, really strong strokes, and very loose strokes could earn you more points than a painting that's really trying to replicate a landscape, almost just like copying a landscape and looking like any other landscape painting that could be oil or acrylic or pastel. So you want to separate yourself out from the massive types of landscape paintings that are done with mediums in general, and pick out what it is about pastels that you really want to convey in terms of the uniqueness of the medium. This is a sort of like an aqua, hard-edged aqua pastel I'm using to do some blending, but also to bring out some of the atmospheric effects of the distant part of the tops of the trees and the portions where the light is just kind of creating like this very faded, washed out look. So it came in really handy, this aqua hard edge pastel, to do some of the blending. And I also like to blend with pastel pencils rather than always using a tortillon or using a palette knife. And that also gives you the opportunity of creating a little more firm lines and marks with your pastels by using the strong pastel pencils. Some more highlights in the center focal area of the tree. The question I often get asked is, when do you know when you're done with a painting? And oh, here's the tortillon again to do a little bit of that that blending work. By the way, when you can do blending with a tortillon, I often will rub the tortillon tip on top of the pastel color or the pastel that I'm using that I want to blend, so that I could kind of bring up that color, because sometimes the tortillon will have a color that's maybe from a different painting that's not going to fit well. It's going to mess something up here, but in a very small, easily correctable fashion. Um, but you could kind of step back and let the painting sit there and gel if you're, when we're trying to figure out if you're done with the painting. But in this case, again, I'm going to just reiterate how I felt the rocks were just done, and I didn't want to touch them any further. This is a light orange yellow pastel pencil, and this is doing some of the blending work for me, as well as building some of that sun glow impact. This is a purple pastel pencil, and I like to do purple in my greens. Works well for the shaded areas. It kind of grays out the greens, also being that purple is composed of red and blue, and red is a complement of green, so it helps create a little more of a grayish impact to the distance. A little more sun highlights here. So yeah, so speaking of grays, I try to avoid using grays. I like to create the gray effect by using the complements of the colors wherever I can. Um, As for black, I use black sparingly, but because I like to build contrast, especially in here with the rocks, I'll apply some black, but then I'll go back and apply a little bit of a different hue. So it typically would be a very dark blue on top of that black, so it doesn't look like I'm just using black in the landscape. As there really is, when you think about it, there really is not much black in the landscape other than burnt wood, for example. So take a careful look, especially with these reference photos that darken shade so much that it looks like it's black, but it's really not black. Plein air painting will help solve that as you get to experience doing plein air painting, but also just kind of going for walks and hikes and observing and taking notes, or don't even take notes, just kind of walk and observe, and you'll know what you're looking at. So when you look at a photo, you know where the shortcomings are in that particular photograph. So as I mentioned about pastels, capitalize on the medium, exude the key features, do some broad brushstrokes and show those marks. A little more pastel pencil work in here. I use a white pastel pencil also to soften some of the edges in the canopy. Building a little more contrast. I actually think that's a black pastel right there, or it's a deep blue-black pastel. So the little more light blotches on the tree actually does have these white rings or blotches on them. The patterns. Actually, I should probably research as to what type of tree this is. So I had to convey some of that with a light. There's a very light yellowish kind of a color, and a light mauve. Bring in more of that yellow. Again, your yellow is really going to be the foreground strength type of a color. It does fade off and disappear in the distance, as we know, based on value or color theory, right? So I'm softening also some of the edges there with some of that yellow to bring in the pattern of sunlight that crept through from the backlighting here into the foreground portions of the tree. You'll find, with pastel painting in particular, the looseness of painting, of creating work, because try not to overwork sections. I mean, you could keep working it and working it and working it, and realizing that it kind of loses some of its spontaneity by working sections too much. So, and that's why I kind of like to have a certain percentage of my paintings and the landscapes being kind of blurred out to avoid distraction from the focal point. So regarding the reference photo, you don't want to create a replica of a scene, unless you're doing, I'll call them travel paintings, and I do some of those when I hike the national parks. I'll take an iconic scene, and that might be like Devil's Tower in Wyoming, or it could be the which I've done several paintings now, the Yellowstone Falls, Grand Canyon to the Yellowstone at Yellowstone National Park. And those are definitely iconic travel type scenes. And I've done paintings that pretty much conveyed that scene. Light of the Mist, you can see that on my website. It's called Light of the Mist, and that is a pastel painting of the Yellowstone Falls. And the mist really wasn't there the way I conveyed it in the painting. So we're definitely making changes to the scene, not replicating it perfectly. But there are some scenes that are more travel related that could be reasonably replicated. I kind of like the creative stuff like this. I think it's a lot more fun to do. So when I look at a landscape opportunity to do a painting, I like to comprise characteristics that evoke mystery in that particular scene, shape the landscape into something new. And kind of think, try not to pick cliche subject matter. I'm afraid to say that waterfalls are cliche, but I like doing waterfalls. But the usual barns, for example, in the Midwest are a cliche, and certain rivers can be in mountains, and stuff just gets to be just so repetitive and popular that try to step back from that and think about how you can select portions of the landscape that are truly unique. I think that's one of the juror points that I came across recently, was that the subject matter is not cliche nor sentimental. So separate yourself out from other artists, and certainly photo taking that's that's so prevalent out there from folks who travel throughout the world. Be unique. Take these different perspectives, these different look at the vantage points of a particular scene. If you have a reference photo, take several varieties of that photo from different angles, and think about what would be the most interesting angle or vantage point to convey that particular scene. This is that upper right left section that I forgot to do. You can see most of it there in the screen, but it's again a highlighted edge of a rock, and then I'll bring in a little bit of a little darker value to build some of the texture or the dimension of that rock there on the left. More highlights again to capture that early morning sun. Here's where I'm putting a little more deeper value into that rock to give it that texture. This is the white pastel pencil to soften out the upper edge, mostly the upper edge of that tree trunk. See, that's where now, there to the left of the pencil, where you see there, the tree trunk is a little wider up that section. And I saw that and I said, I got to do something about that. That's not quite technically correct. So you need to think about the technicals of your work of art too, and fix things as they need be. But the tortillon here came in handy, as well as the white pastel pencil in doing some blending and softening of the edges. As you can see, there's the white pastel pencil working up that way. I'm bringing in a little bit of a dark blue now into the brown crevices because I think, as I mentioned before, use a different color in that value section. So same value, but bring in a different color. And because of the way there were this purple, gray, the faded blues in this painting told me, hey, let's bring in a little bit more blue into the dark areas of this particular tree. So here I'm adding a little bit of highlights to some of the branches. We don't want a straight branch. We don't want even a curved branch, but it's all the same color and value. We want to vary that. The bottoms of the branches tend to be darker. The tops of the branches facing the sky, the light will be going to be lighter. Some of them are going to pick up some sun reflections. Again, we're adding more variety. Building some more contrast with the lighting behind the tree. So by working this section of the tree, I realized that we got to watch the width of the tree trunks to ensure that they are technically correct. When we mentioned about paintings being technically correct, well, that's just it's just what it means. It means the drawing accuracy of the landscape items. So I'll fix the wide trunk portion on the lower right in a bit here. Excuse me. A painting should have an impact, produce a feeling or a thought, and I think this painting is like it's like the awe of the early morning sun, and the fascination with some of the landscape elements, such as these huge rocks. Again, softening some of those edges, smoothing them out a bit, making sure that the tree is proportionally correct, wider at the bottom, narrower at the top, just working this back and forth. That's pretty much it. Thank you for visiting. Here's my contact information, my email, and if you'd like the digital reference photo, I'll send that to you. Just email me at that address, and you could attempt to do this painting yourself, but also try to do the acrylic underpainting, which is that was the fun part, and see that crazy acrylic underpainting video previously published. My website address, and by all means follow me on Instagram. I'm often publishing new paintings or showing new paintings that I do. I do about a painting a week for my early morning art excursions, and I'll also announce that whether new videos are about to come out on Instagram. So thank you again for visiting. I hope you've learned something important here, and happy pastel painting.